blood cells with that one gene for sickle cell anemia get infected by this malaria parasite, they sickle and kill that parasite or cause that parasite to be killed. It seems to be an adaptation that people living in those parts of the world where malaria is common, that their bodies have taken on this adaptation that causes them to be able to ward off malaria by having that sickling cell. Now, if you remember, your genes, just what genes you have isn't all of the story. And I had a student in class that had one gene for sickle cell anemia. The problem is that it isn't just an infection by a malaria parasite that can cause sickling. I believe in his case there were certain stressors that also would cause that. So his red blood cells weren't normal all the time, and they were a lot of the time, most of the time, and it was nice to have this ability to ward off sickle cell anemia or malaria, but it came with a cost in his case that caused him to have a flare-up of sickle cell anemia when stresses got to a certain point in his life. So there were these other triggers that would cause that as well. So it's not just an either-or situation, there are always complications to it. Okay, so that's sickle cell anemia. If I go back to this, so it's the importance of the proper shape and function of the red blood cell. I hope I made that clear. Also carbon monoxide. One of the problems with carbon monoxide is that it will bind to the heme group and displace an oxygen. And a carbon monoxide molecule, from exhaust emissions, will bind 200 times more tightly to that heme molecule than an oxygen. You don't want the oxygen binding tightly there because the purpose is for that oxygen to be given to the tissues. Problem is carbon monoxide will bind tightly to it and stay bound for several hours. So getting too much of that carbon monoxide in your system will lead to sort of anemia-like conditions as well. All right, so I'm just looking at my little notes here, seeing what I wanted to talk about. Got that. Okay. One last thing I wanted to mention, it was kind of to fulfill a promise from lab. In lab, we talked about blood typing. You did blood typing. There was the ABO blood type, and that was looking at what markers there were on blood cells that would indicate that they belonged to you. Okay, and some of you had A markers, and some of you had B markers, and some of you had no markers. You were type O blood. I don't think any of you had AB markers. So there were also this other category, and I remember I said there were like 20 different types of markers. ABO was one type, and RH was another type that we tested for. And most of you, roughly around the population is roughly around 85% of the population is RH positive, which means you have RH antigens. Roughly about 15% of the population does not have the RH antigen. And some of you mentioned an awareness of what it was to be sensitized or the significance of RH negative blood type in women. Okay, so here's the deal. If you're a woman and you get pregnant and you have an RH positive baby, but you are RH negative, not a problem because baby's blood and mom's blood don't mix. There's a placenta in between that keep them separate. But during childbirth, because of the trauma of childbirth, some of baby's blood can be forced back across the placenta into mom's bloodstream. Now, if mom is RH negative and some of baby's RH positive blood gets in there, that can be a problem because it's the wrong blood type. And so mom's blood looks at that and says, doesn't like that blood there. So her body will develop antibodies. If you remember in plasma, we talked about gamma globulins. That's one of the types of plasma proteins. We talked about alpha globulins with thyroid and the importance of iodine and salt. Beta globulins with sex hormone, keeping them in the blood so they aren't filtered out in the kidney. Well, there's also gamma globulins, and those are actually antibodies. They have that Y shape. We'll talk more about them in the lymphatic system and immunity. Okay, And so the mom's body then, in response to that Rh positive blood showing up in her system, will produce antibodies that attack and destroy Rh positive blood cells. No problem still, because the baby was born fine. It's baby number 2 that comes along. If mom gets pregnant again, and baby number 2 is again Rh positive, which baby's likely to be, there can be a problem. And that is that while mom's blood can't get across the placenta into baby, the antibodies in mom's blood can cross the placenta and get into the baby. So if mom's antibodies that attack Rh positive blood cross the placenta, get into the baby, they'll start attacking the baby's blood, make the baby anemic, and in times past could even kill the baby because it was attacking and destroying baby's blood. Nowadays, it's not a big deal because shortly after birth, doctors will give mom a shot that will basically destroy any of baby's blood that does cross the placenta and prevent that from being a big deal. But that was the significance of the Rh positive, Rh negative issue from lab. All right, did that. Okay, so at this point I would ask if there's questions, but yeah, I'm going to try to have the forum open on Moodle so you can ask questions that others can see. So at this point we're going to go to the last kind of, not the last, but second to the last kind of formed element from blood, and that's these white blood cells. Don't worry, I don't have as much to say about each of them. Okay, so I've also got another set of slides that I put on Moodle, and I'd like you to look at those. So the white blood cells then would look something like this. Now this is obviously an artist's rendition of them, but I like this because it shows some of the detail we want that doesn't necessarily show up very well when we just look at a blood slide. Now some of you did have a basophil. That's a rare thing. Basophils and eosinophils don't show up very often. Most of what you saw on your blood slides were neutrophils and lymphocytes, and there was an occasional monocyte. But these two don't show up very often. What I want you to notice from this picture is these little bubbly things on those blood cells. And those are called granules. And we would call these granular lymphocytes or granular leukocytes or granular white blood cells. And we would call these agranular leukocytes or white blood cells. I'm just going to use the word white blood cell. Agranular, without granules. Granular, with granules. Okay? I'm going to scroll down here just a little bit so you can see what it looks like in an actual blood slide. Okay, in an actual blood slide then, here we would have a basophil. Up here would be an eosinophil. Here's a neutrophil. You really don't see the granules too well. Neutrophil here and here. This would be a monocyte, and these two would be lymphocytes. So that's what they might look like in a real blood cell. You can see these red blood cells starting to get bumps. They're actually crenating, if you remember that word from lab. Okay. So just wanted to mention just a few details about the significance of these, because a doctor, if you're sick, one of the things a doctor might do is draw blood and do a differential count. They would find out how many of each of these you have in your blood, because elevated levels of any of them can indicate a particular thing. For instance, neutrophils. Now you should have a lot of those, and their job is to eat up bacteria in your body. Okay. Yeah, that's when I talk about what they do. I want you to realize that I'm just giving you sort of the main thing, but there are lots of other things that they can be involved with. But I'm going to give you the main thing. So neutrophils, their main thing is to eat up bacteria. And generally, you find 50 to 70% of your white blood cells would be of those sorts. Basophils and eosinophils, if you've got an allergy or a parasitic infection, they're going to show up in greater numbers. So a person with malaria would have a lot of those. Basophils, right here, they have a sort of a specific other function, and that is these granules, these packets of little bubbles on them, they actually carry histamine and heparin. Now, if you think histamine is not, I suspect, an unusual or a term that you haven't heard. I'm thinking you've heard of histamine. Maybe you've heard of an antihistamine. Okay, the purpose of that is to open up your airways and your passages, so you can breathe better. The reason that they're closing up is because the tissues around them are swelling and becoming inflamed and closing up the passage. So you want to reverse that process and open them up. That's what an antihistamine does. So histamine is going to cause that to happen. Heparin, also a term I've used before, that's what was lining the sides of that little capillary tube that we spun. And the purpose of heparin was to prevent that blood from clotting. Okay, so these packets carry a substance, heparin, that will keep your blood from clotting. You might want to ask why you would want your blood not to clot. And the other is that they carry a substance that will make your tissues swell up. Now, when we get to the lymphatic system and immunity, we're going to talk about why. But for right now, I just want to mention that those occur here. So in addition to allergic response and parasitic response, that particular white blood cell, that basophil, carries histamine and heparin, which have other functions as well. Okay, so that's the granular ones. The agranule, the monocyte right here, monocytes, yeah. They are involved with basically eating up other cells that are targeted for destruction. If you remember when we talked about atherosclerosis, if you have too much fat in your bloodstream, it was these monocytes that would turn into macrophages, and macrophages that would turn into foam cells that would eat up that extra fat, but would then contribute to the development of atherosclerosis. So right there. And then lymphocytes right here and here. We're going to talk about them quite a bit of detail in the lymphatic system immunity. There's two of them there because we're going to see there's two different types of lymphocytes. B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. B because they mature in the bone marrow, and T because those mature in the thymus gland, or the thymus gland in the neck. Okay, or you will know that. Okay, and so of all these white blood cells, the most common are the neutrophils and the lymphocytes. Those are the ones you probably mostly saw in your blood site. A lot of you saw monocytes as well. And so there's a few of them around as well. What else did I want to say? Yeah, I alluded to this before. You're familiar with mononucleosis, and that's kind of a disease that was not named correctly. It's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, which is a common virus. You've probably all been exposed to it as children. It probably didn't make you very sick. But as you turn into young adults and adults, that virus will actually take up residence in a number of places in your body, but one of the places is in the salivary glands along the neck. And you've heard of mono being referred to as the kissing disease, because you can catch it from kissing somebody that has it. And that's true, because those dormant viruses can, if you get stressed, immune system gets repressed a bit, they can spring to life, and if you give somebody a smooch, you can actually pass that virus to them doing that. Or if you drink off a pop can and you've got those active viruses and pass it to somebody else, they do. That's as well too. I got a kick out of the CDC website when I was looking this over beforehand. They've said on there that you can also get it from contacting baby drool. Okay, I'm good with that. So anyway, those are the main kinds of white blood cells. When we talk about lymphatic system and immunity next, they're going to come into play again, but I wanted you to see what they look like. Let's see if I had anything else I wanted to say. That's about what I wanted to say. The last thing for this particular lesson, going a little longer than I meant, was the megakaryocytes. Right here. Basically, this stem cell can also turn into megakaryoblast, and megakaryoblast, you can think of them as blowing up, and all you have left is these fragments. Those fragments are platelets. And the platelets are the first thing that plugs a break in a vessel. So that's their job, is to, anytime you get a cut or something, it's platelets that are going to form there first, and plug that vessel and stop the flow of blood. And so a number of you know that you can donate platelets and make some money from that. And again, they are, though, just another example of a type of formed element, a type of cell or cell part in your blood, all of which originate from stem cells in your long bones, in the marrow of your long bones. All right. I think that's about where I'm going to stop with this one. The next video will begin the lymphatic system and immunity. And so, yeah, look for that one to come. Thank you.